finally, I'll just say this, and then is that one of the things that I think marks perhaps the way I work is I try to partner with the dolphins. If I'm working with a dolphin or an elephant, I do that as well, a bit, but less frequently. But we'll focus with dolphins. I try to give them a voice and try to see what they'll do, what their ways are, rather than training them to do things or asking them to do certain things. I give them things to see reflections of their minds and their types of intelligence.
About theory of mind, um, we mean the capacity to uh, be able to sense that another creature is having different thoughts than we are. That is simply not a um, projection of us. And we sense as human beings, we sense what people are thinking about us by observing their eyes, even when they're not saying something. Whether we sense they're a threat, whether they want to manipulate us, whether they're open and genuine, whether they want a relationship. So, um, when you were interacting with dolphins, um, do you believe you were able to sense um, their curiosity in you?
Well, I think when you talk about that, it's like, are they there? Are they with you? Are they engaged? Do they stay with you? And you read the whole body language, and then you say, do they initiate? So you take all that into account. And again, eye contact has a lot to do with it. I gave you the story, the timeout story. That was very important. That suggested some sense of theory of mind. If she used that back to me, that I would understand. I think that's why it was such an astonishing thing. And maybe we can end on this note because I'm going to have to stop in a moment. So I'm just going to say that the when I the thing this story about Circe that was so moving to me was that she used it back, and my doctoral thesis was called Pragmatics of Human Dolphin Communication, the function, how it works. I didn't intend to include that episode or that experiment that I did to test whether Circe was really using that or not, because I didn't know it was going to happen, but I actually wrote that up as a chapter for my thesis. And it was perfect because I was trying to understand how could we create a communication code with another dolphin. And I had done other experiments to see could they visually discriminate these forms? How would they use a simple system if we gave them the symbols on just a plain wooden board? How would they use it? Would it match their preferences? She gave me the best chapter in the book. And that's why I come back and say, I really try to work with them as partners. I really try to come to them with respect and give them a voice in what I do. And then my voice hopefully will speak for protecting them in their environment.
So, in that relationship that you describe um, with the dolphin, and you making the error of giving them this spiky tail, you conclude that you feel sure that she wanted to communicate with you and she knew she could communicate with you.
Yes, I do. I think from the tests that we did, she knew the function. She might not have known what it meant exactly, because even in humans, you don't know exactly what somebody intends, but you see how it functions. And it functioned with her when she did something wrong. When I did something wrong, she used it back to me.
Yeah.
So there was something in there where it was fascinating. It was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had with a
Hmm.
dolphin, and one of the first.
Okay. So very quickly, um, you you're not prepared to go as far as say that you can understand curiosity in a dolphin. You may agree that they can be curious, but you can't go farther than that.
No, I think they show signs of curiosity in many ways. Investigating what happens when they do something. Dolphins are supreme contingency testers. They do that all the time. and that may be driven by curiosity. But to say this is this in this within this box is curiosity of a dolphin, no, I think that would be way too confining. I think they are definitely curious.
So, Diana, the last chapter in your book, The Dolphin in the Mirror, is probably the most revealing part about you personally. Most of your book stays rigorously within science. In the last chapter, you give a different side of yourself. Your study of dolphins seems to be a struggle in you between what you think you can accept as a scientist and what you accept as a whole human being beyond what science knows. You are clear about the limitations of science and seem to sense what's beyond that. In the last chapter of your book, you use the word lenses. You talk about having two mental lenses to view dolphins. One is the lens of the scientist, which is limited, which, as you say, is reductionist. The other lens is what you call a lyrical connection to the magical and ineffable essence of nature. To that, based on your biography, I'd add compassion, empathy, and ethos. Your compassion, your empathy, and your ethos with dolphins. I call that second lens the whole human being, and I wonder if dolphins responded to you because of that. So, having listened to that, is that an accurate interpretation of your last chapter? And why was it important for you to write that last chapter the way you did?
Um, yeah, I do feel very much like when I approach dolphins and when I've approached them in the past, I try to come pretty open minded as a scientist and as a human being. I mean, I'm both. I'm a scientist that happens to be a human. And, as a child, I looked with wonder at the animal world. I still do. And I just have a great deal of respect for the animals around us, whether they're dolphins or dogs or other animals. And when I was younger, I always felt that I had this connection with my dog. I could communicate with words with my parents and my brother, but I always felt that I had this other connection. And now, as scientists, we know we're connected with other animals, both cognitively, behaviorally, and we communicate with other animals, not in ways that we necessarily communicate with each other, or I'm communicating with you now, but we read each other's body language. We learn the patterns of each other, and I think that's pretty accepted in the scientific community that there are many forms of communication. So, going back to your specific question, I study them in ways that other scientists study them, and perhaps some ways that have not been used before. I'm happy to talk about those. But I also just try to spend a lot of time listening to them and watching them. And I think that's critical. I'll just mention a few things that might be helpful here. I work with an organization called the Interspecies Internet. I don't know if you've heard of this yet, but I work with Peter Gabriel, who's a well-known musician and a visionary, Vince Cerf, who was one of the co-founders of the internet, and Neil Gershenfeld, who's with MIT, and he looks at connectivity across people and computers, and much more. And we have a forum where we bring together scientists and philosophers and artists to try to understand more about animals, and that's kind of the spirit I come to this discipline with, because I was actually an art major as well. Before I studied art. I worked as a set designer, a stage designer in the theater for many years. So when I speak about looking at them in other ways, I look at their movements. I look at I've used dance notation in some ways to look at how they move and document how they move in the early days that I watched them. And I try to look at their own vocalizations in ways that's not terribly biased by what's been said before. And that's helped me a great deal. Finally, I'll just say this, and then is that one of the things that I think marks perhaps the way I work is I try to partner with the dolphins. If I'm working with a dolphin or an elephant, I do that as well, a bit, but less frequently. But we'll focus with dolphins. I try to give them a voice and try to see what they'll do, what their ways are, rather than training them to do things or asking them to do certain things. I give them things to see reflections of their minds and their types of intelligence.
Okay, that's an interesting explanation. Um, but like I said, that last chapter is very revealing and very personal about you. And w- did you have any trepidation in putting that chapter in your book?
Not really, because I think as a scientist, again, you're a human being too, and you can't step away from that. So I, again, perhaps it's because I was in the arts and theater and dance before I started the scientific journey. I can't help but looking at them in those ways and seeing them as creatures, as animals that are so very different from us from an evolutionary perspective. We've been separated from them evolutionarily for about 97 to 100 million years. Their bodies couldn't be more different than ours. Their types of communication, they use whistles and clicks and all sorts of other burst pulse signals that are quite different from us. Actually, not so different from lots of other animals on this planet, however. And how do we start understanding the nature of their intelligence? So again, I use computers. We use hydrophones underwater that are underwater microphones. We use cameras. We use drones. We're using all sorts of equipment, but putting that all aside and just watching them and listening to them and seeing those patterns is something that really helps me understand. And then just the interactions you have. And I'll tell you some stories about the nature of those interactions that is very humbling and makes you feel, wow, this is really a magnificent mind. What do I do next to understand?